The spring rain fell hard on the muddy roads of Czechoslovakia. Colonel Heinrich Müller stood outside his command tent and watched his soldiers. They looked like ghosts. Their uniforms were torn and dirty. Their faces showed no hope. These men had been fighting for 6 years. Now, in late April 1945, everyone knew the truth. Germany was losing the war. Müller was 42 years old. He had fought in the First World War as a young man. Now he commanded 2,000 Wehrmacht soldiers who were trapped between two massive armies. To the east, the Soviet Red Army was coming like a storm. To the west, the American forces were advancing but moving slower. Müller had to make an impossible choice. The radio in his tent crackled with broken messages. The German command structure was falling apart. Adolf Hitler was dead in his bunker in Berlin. The Nazi leadership was either dead, captured, or running away. Orders came and went, but none of them made sense anymore. Some commanders ordered their men to fight to the last bullet. Others simply disappeared in the night. Sergeant Joseph Becker walked into the tent. He was 35 years old and had been with Müller since 1942. His face was hard like stone, but his eyes told a different story. They showed fear. "Sir, the men are talking," Becker said quietly. "They know the Soviets are only 50 miles away. They can hear the artillery at night." Müller nodded. He heard it too. The deep thunder that rolled across the hills. Every night it got louder. Every night it got closer. "What are they saying?" Müller asked. Becker looked at his boots. "They remember the Eastern Front. They remember what happened at Stalingrad. The men who surrendered to the Soviets never came home. Their families never heard from them again." This was the nightmare that haunted every German soldier. The Eastern Front had been brutal beyond words. The Wehrmacht had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 during Operation Barbarossa. Hitler had promised a quick victory. Instead, millions died in the frozen wasteland. The Germans had committed terrible crimes against Soviet civilians and prisoners. Now the Red Army wanted revenge. Private Hans Werner entered the tent. He was only 19 years old. His hands shook as he held his rifle. "Sir, there are rumors. Other regiments are marching west. They are trying to reach the American lines to surrender." Müller felt something twist in his stomach. The Americans were 80 miles away. The journey would be dangerous. Soviet patrols were everywhere. The roads were clogged with refugees fleeing the fighting. But the Americans followed the Geneva Convention. They treated prisoners according to international law. This was not just rumor. This was documented fact. "Get the officers together," Müller ordered. "We need to talk." An hour later, 10 officers crowded into the small tent. Maps covered the table. The situation was clear and terrible. The Soviets would reach their position in 3 days, maybe 4. The German forces had almost no ammunition left. Food was gone. Medical supplies were gone. Half the vehicles had no fuel. Captain Otto Kessler spoke first. He was a Nazi party member, a true believer. "We have our orders. We stand and fight. We die with honor for the fatherland." "The fatherland is dead," said Lieutenant Franz Weber. He was 24 years old, but looked 50. "Hitler is dead. Berlin has fallen. What are we fighting for?" "For honor," Kessler shouted. "We are German soldiers." Müller raised his hand for silence. "I have been a German soldier for 25 years. I know about honor, but I also know about duty. My duty now is to my men. These soldiers have families. They have mothers and fathers and wives and children waiting for them. The war is over. Everyone knows this. The question is whether we die for nothing or whether we survive to rebuild our country." The tent went silent. Outside, they could hear soldiers talking around campfires. Young voices, old voices, all tired, all afraid. "If we surrender to the Soviets, we disappear," Becker said. "My cousin surrendered at Kursk in 1943. His wife got 1 letter. Then nothing. 2 years of nothing." "The Americans are different," Werner added. "My brother was captured in France last year. He is in a POW camp in England. He writes letters. He gets food. He is alive." Kessler stood up angrily. "This is treason. We should court-martial anyone who suggests surrender." "Court-martial us then," Müller said coldly. "But first tell me who will carry out the sentence. Tell me which of our starving, exhausted soldiers will shoot their own officers for trying to keep them alive." The reality hung in the air like smoke. The Nazi regime was finished. The grand promises were lies. The Third Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years was dying after only 12. Müller looked at each officer. "We march west at dawn. We move fast and light. We destroy the heavy weapons we cannot carry. We avoid Soviet patrols. We reach American lines, and we surrender properly, with military dignity. Anyone who wants to stay and fight can stay. But I am taking my men home. That night, word spread through the camp like wildfire. The regiment would march west. Men gathered their few belongings. They wrote letters to families, not knowing if the letters would ever arrive. Some soldiers cried with relief. Others argued bitterly about duty and honor. Mueller could not sleep. He walked through the camp and saw faces. So many young faces. Boys who should have been in school or working on farms. Instead, they were here, caught in the death throes of a mad dream that I in the distance. The Soviet artillery rumbled. Closer than yesterday. The sound of the approaching stormed at dawn. 2,000 German soldiers began their march west. They were not the only ones. All across Czechoslovakia and Germany, entire divisions were making the same desperate choice. The greatest mass surrender in military history was beginning. Over 500,000 German soldiers would choose American captivity over Soviet revenge. They would choose life over a meaningless death. Colonel Heinrich Müller led his men into the morning fog. Behind them, the thunder of Soviet guns. Ahead, an uncertain future. But at least it was a future. The campfire burned low as 5 soldiers sat in a circle. It was their third night of marching west. The regiment had covered 30 miles, moving through forests and back roads to avoid Soviet patrols. Now they rested in an abandoned farmhouse, and the men told stories. These were not happy stories. These were warnings about what waited behind them in the east. Sergeant Joseph Becker poked the fire with a stick. His face looked orange in the firelight. "I was at Stalingrad," he said quietly. "Winter of 1942. Coldest place in hell." The younger soldiers leaned forward. Everyone had heard of Stalingrad. It was where the German army had been destroyed. Over 300,000 German soldiers had been trapped in the city by the Soviet forces. Only 6,000 ever made it home. "We thought we were winning," Becker continued. "We took half the city. Then winter came. -40 degrees. Our guns froze. Our trucks would not start. We burned furniture to stay warm. We ate the horses. Then we ate leather from our boots." Private Hans Werner listened with wide eyes. He had been only 16 when Stalingrad fell. Now he understood why the older soldiers looked so haunted. The Soviets surrounded us completely. No supplies could get through. No ammunition. No food. No medicine. Men died from cold, from hunger, from disease. The wounded just lay in the snow because we had no doctors left. Becker's voice was flat, like he was reading from a book. "When we finally surrendered in February 1943, we were skeletons. Walking corpses. What happened to the prisoners?" Werner asked. "They marched us east. Thousands of us. We walked for weeks in the snow. Anyone who fell was left to die. The Soviets gave us no food, no water. They were angry. We had destroyed their city. We had killed their people. They wanted us to suffer." Corporal Ludwig Schmidt spoke up. He was from Munich, a former teacher. "My uncle was captured at Kursk in 1943. The biggest tank battle in history. 7,000 tanks fighting across the Russian plains. The Soviets won. My uncle's entire panzer division surrendered." "Did he survive?" someone asked. Schmidt shook his head. "My aunt received one letter. It said he was being sent to a labor camp in Siberia. That was 2 years ago. Nothing since then. The Red Cross cannot find him. He is probably dead in some frozen mine, digging coal until his body gave up." The fire crackled. No one spoke for a moment. They all knew the statistics. Of the 90,000 Germans who surrendered at Stalingrad, only 5,000 survived the Soviet prison camps. The rest died from starvation, disease, or being worked to death. Private Ernst Hoffmann was only 17. His voice cracked when he spoke. "Why do the Soviets hate us so much?" Becker looked at the boy with sad eyes. "Because we earned that hate, son." Operation Barbarossa in 1941. Hitler ordered the invasion of Soviet Union. 3 million German soldiers crossed the border. We were told the Soviets were subhuman. We were told to show no mercy. And we did not, Schmidt added quietly. The Wehrmacht, the regular army, we followed terrible orders. Villages were burned. Civilians were killed. Soviet prisoners of war were starved in camps. Over 3 million Soviet POWs died in German custody. The SS was even worse. They murdered entire towns. Women, children, everyone. Werner felt sick. "I did not know." They did not tell us this in training. The Nazi propaganda did not talk about our crimes, Becker said. They only talked about our victories. But the Soviets remember everything. Every village we burned. Every prisoner we starved. Every civilian we killed. That is why they are coming for revenge. That is why surrendering to them means death. A new voice joined the conversation. It was Lieutenant Paul Fisher from another company. He had fought in France. The Americans are different. I fought against them at the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Hitler's last big offensive. We pushed through the Ardennes forest, trying to split the Allied forces. Did the Americans run? Hoffman asked. Fisher laughed bitterly. No, they fought like devils. Especially at a town called Bastogne. We surrounded them completely. We demanded surrender. The American commander sent back one word. Nuts. It meant no. They held that town until reinforcements arrived. We lost the battle. We lost everything. What happened when you were captured? Werner asked. I was wounded by artillery. Shrapnel in my leg. I could not walk. My squad left me behind when they retreated. I thought I was dead. Fisher rolled up his pant leg. A long scar ran down his calf. American medics found me. They treated my wound. They gave me morphine for the pain. They gave me food and water. Then they sent me to a hospital behind their lines. The soldiers around the fire stared at him. This was different from the Soviet stories. There was a German prisoner of war camp in France where I stayed for 3 months before I escaped. Fisher continued. We had beds. We had food. It was not luxury, but it was not death. The Americans followed the Geneva Convention. International law says prisoners must be treated humanely. The Americans actually followed this law. The Soviets never signed the Geneva Convention, Becker explained. And even if they had, after what we did to them, they would not follow it. Not for us. Hoffman looked at the fire. So we march west because the Americans will let us live. Yes, Becker said. The Americans believe in rules. Even in war, they have rules. We broke all the rules in the Soviet Union. Now we run from the justice we created. The sound of distant engines made everyone freeze. Soviet trucks? Soviet tanks? The men grabbed their weapons and waited in the darkness. But the sound faded away to the east. Not coming for them. Not yet. Werner thought about his mother back in Hamburg. The city had been bombed to ruins by British and American air raids. Over 40,000 people had died in the firestorms. But if he surrendered to the Americans, he might see her again. If he fell into Soviet hands, she would wait forever for a son who would never come home. The choice was not about politics or ideology anymore. It was about survival. It was about the simple human desire to live and see another day. The Nazi dream of conquest had turned into a nightmare of retreat and desperation. Colonel Mueller appeared at the farmhouse door. Put out the fire. We march again in 1 hour. We have 40 miles left to the American lines. Move quietly. Stay alert. We are close to freedom now. The soldiers scattered to wake their comrades. Behind them in the east, the Soviet army rolled forward like an unstoppable machine. Ahead, somewhere in the darkness, lay the American forces and a chance for life. The race was not over yet. The road was chaos. Colonel Mueller had never seen anything like it in 25 years of military service. His regiment of 2,000 soldiers was now mixed with 10,000 others. Germans from every branch of the military marched together in a massive column that stretched for miles. Wehrmacht infantry walked beside Luftwaffe pilots who had no planes. Navy sailors who had lost their ships marched next to SS officers who had removed their distinctive insignia. All of them were heading west. But it was not just soldiers. Thousands of German civilians clogged the roads too. Whole families pushed carts loaded with their belongings. Old women carried children on their backs. Men pulled wagons filled with everything they owned. Everyone had heard the stories about what happened when the Soviet army arrived. Everyone was running. Mueller watched from horseback as his organized retreat became a desperate flood of humanity. His carefully planned march had dissolved into something much larger and more dangerous. Control was slipping away. Sir, we need to move faster, Sergeant Becker said, riding up beside him. The Soviets are only 20 miles behind us now. Their advanced scouts could catch us by tomorrow. Mueller knew Becker was right, but how could they move faster? The roads were packed. Every village they passed added more people to the exodus. Abandoned German equipment littered the roadside. Tanks with no fuel. Trucks with no drivers. Artillery pieces destroyed by their own crews, so the Soviets could not use them. A shot rang out ahead. The column stopped suddenly. Thousands of people froze. Mueller spurred his horse forward to investigate. He found Captain Otto Kessler holding a pistol, standing over a dead horse. What happened? Mueller demanded. The animal broke its leg in a pothole, Kessler said coldly. It could not continue. I ended its suffering. Mueller looked at the dead horse and at the family standing nearby. A father, mother, and 3 young children. The horse had been pulling their cart. Now they had nothing. You could have helped them find another solution, Mueller said. We do not have time for civilians, Kessler replied. We are soldiers. They slow us down. Mueller felt his anger rise, but pushed it down. We are all Germans now, Captain. The war is over. There is no difference between soldiers and civilians anymore. We all survive together or we all die together. Kessler's face went red, but he said nothing. He holstered his pistol and walked away. Private Werner helped the family load their belongings onto a handcart. The father thanked him with tears in his eyes. These small acts of kindness were all that separated them from complete chaos. That WWII afternoon, Mueller heard gunshots behind the column. Soviet scouts had made contact with the rear guard. The race was becoming real. German soldiers at the back of the column returned fire and then ran to catch up with the others. We need to split up, Lieutenant Fischer suggested. Smaller groups move faster. Mueller shook his head. Smaller groups are easier targets for Soviet patrols. We stay together. Safety in numbers. They pushed through the night. No one slept. Children cried. Soldiers carried exhausted civilians on their backs. When a wagon broke down, a dozen hands immediately worked to fix it. The column became like a living creature, moving as one organism driven by pure survival instinct. On the morning of the 6th day, they reached a river. The bridge had been destroyed by retreating German engineers days earlier. The water was cold and fast. It looked impossible to cross. There is a ford 3 miles north, a local farmer told them. The water is shallower there. But you must hurry. The Soviets blew up most of the bridges behind you. The column turned north. 3 miles became 5 because the roads were bad. When they reached the ford, Mueller saw it was still dangerous. The water came up to a man's chest. The current was strong, but there was no choice. Soldiers cross first, Mueller ordered. Form a human chain. Help the civilians across. Children and elderly go in the middle where it is safest. For 3 hours, they crossed. Men linked arms and braced against the current. Women passed children from hand to hand. Twice, people slipped and were nearly swept away. Both times, soldiers dove in and pulled them to safety. Werner carried a 5-year-old girl on his shoulders. The child was terrified of the water. Do not look down, he told her gently. Look at the trees on the other side. We are almost there. When the girl reached the far bank safely, her mother hugged Werner and sobbed. He realized he was crying too. They were all so tired, so scared, so desperate to live. Just as the last civilians entered the water, rifle shots echoed from the south. Soviet reconnaissance troops had found them. Bullets hit the water, sending up small splashes. Rear guard, hold them off, Mueller shouted. Everyone else, cross now. 50 German soldiers took positions behind trees and rocks. They fired at the approaching Soviets, buying time for the others. The sound of gunfire was constant now. Men fell on both sides. Becker organized the defense while Mueller helped the last civilians across. An old man slipped and went under. Werner dove into the water without hesitation and pulled him up, coughing and sputtering. Fall back, Mueller finally ordered the rear guard. Everyone across now. The soldiers ran into the water, still firing behind them. Soviet bullets kicked up dirt on the bank. 2 Germans were hit and fell into the river. Their comrades pulled them along, their blood mixing with the water. On the far side, the column regrouped and kept moving. Behind them, the Soviet scouts reached the river but did not cross. They were too few. They would wait for reinforcements. Mueller counted his men. He had lost 30 soldiers in the river crossing and the firefight. 30 families who would wait forever for someone to come home. The guilt was heavy, but he had no time for it now. How far to American lines? Fischer asked. 20 miles, Mueller said. Maybe less. We should reach them by tomorrow if we keep moving. The column marched through the afternoon and into another night. No one complained. No one stopped. Every step took them farther from the Soviet vengeance and closer to American mercy. In the darkness, Werner looked up at the stars. Somewhere ahead was an end to this nightmare. Somewhere ahead was life instead of death. The choice they had made to march west was now irreversible. Their fate lay in American hands. All they could do was keep walking and pray they reached the finish line before the Soviets caught them again. Captain Robert Hayes of the United States 2nd Armored Division saw them first through his binoculars. At first, he thought it was fog rolling across the fields. Then he realized it was people. Thousands and thousands of people moving toward his position like a slow wave. "Sir, you better see this," said Sergeant Mike Torres, pointing east. Hayes focused his binoculars again. German soldiers. More than he had ever seen in one place. They filled the road and the fields on both sides. Behind them came civilians, wagons, horses, and more soldiers. The column stretched back as far as he could see. "Get on the radio," Hayes ordered. "Tell battalion we have a situation. Multiple thousand German troops approaching our position." Torres ran to the radio truck. Within minutes, the entire American front line was on alert. Tanks moved into position. Machine guns were readied. Artillery crews prepared their guns. Every American soldier wondered the same thing. Was this a surrender or a final desperate attack? Hayes was 28 years old, from Texas. He had fought across France and into Germany. He had seen the concentration camps that made grown men vomit. He had seen German soldiers who fought fanatically even when defeat was certain. He did not know what to expect now. The German column stopped about 300 yards away. For a long moment, nothing happened. Both sides watched each other across the open ground. Then a single figure on horseback moved forward. He carried a white flag. "Hold your fire," Hayes shouted to his men. "Let him come." Colonel Heinrich Müller rode slowly toward the American lines. His heart pounded, but his face showed nothing. This was the moment everything depended on. Behind him were 10,000 people who trusted him to keep them alive. Müller stopped 50 yards from the American position. He dismounted and walked forward with the white flag held high. His German uniform was dirty but correct. He removed his pistol and held it by the barrel, offering it forward. Hayes walked out to meet him. The two officers stood face to face. Müller spoke in careful English. "I am Colonel Heinrich Müller of the Wehrmacht. I command the forces behind me. We wish to surrender to the United States Army according to the Geneva Convention. We ask for treatment as prisoners of war under international law." Hayes studied Müller's face. He saw exhaustion, dignity, and desperation. "How many soldiers do you have, Colonel?" "Approximately 8,000 combat troops from various units. Also 2,000 civilians, mostly families fleeing the Soviet advance." Hayes let out a low whistle. His entire battalion was only 600 men. "Colonel, we are not equipped to handle this many prisoners." "We understand," Müller said quietly. "We have almost no weapons left. No ammunition. No supplies. We simply wish to surrender and survive. We have marched for 7 days to reach your lines. The Soviet army is less than a day behind us." Hayes heard something in Müller's voice. Not the voice of a fanatic Nazi, but the voice of a tired man trying to save lives. He had heard that the Germans on the Eastern Front feared Soviet capture more than death itself. "Wait here," Hayes said. He returned to his lines and got on the radio with his battalion commander. The conversation went up the chain quickly. Major to colonel to general. The decision came back within 30 minutes. Accept the surrender. Disarm them. Create a temporary holding area. More MPs and supplies are on the way. Hayes walked back to Müller. "Your surrender is accepted, Colonel. Order your men to lay down their weapons and form into groups. Keep officers with their units to maintain order. Civilians will be separated and moved to a safe area. Do you understand?" Müller felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "I understand. Thank you, Captain." What happened next was unlike anything the American soldiers had ever witnessed. The German column moved forward in organized lines. Soldiers stacked their rifles, machine guns, and pistols in huge piles. Officers surrendered their sidearms formally. Even SS officers who had tried to hide their uniforms came forward reluctantly. Private Werner laid down his rifle and felt relief flood through him. He had carried that weapon for 2 years. Now he was done with it forever. Around him, German soldiers were crying, smiling, collapsing from exhaustion. They had made it. They were alive. The Americans were shocked by what they saw. Most of the German soldiers looked like skeletons. Their uniforms hung off their bodies. Many had no boots, just rags wrapped around their feet. The youngest looked like children. Some could not have been more than 15 years old. Jesus Christ, Torres muttered. These are just kids. Hayes organized his men quickly. I want medical teams checking everyone. Anyone wounded or sick goes to the aid station immediately. Get food and water distributed. Civilians go to that field there. Maintain order, but treat them humanely. They are prisoners of war now, not enemies. An American medic approached a group of German soldiers. One young man was holding his arm strangely. I am Corporal James Miller, the medic said slowly. I need to check injuries. The young German soldier, whose name was Werner, looked confused. Miller pointed to Werner's arm and made a gesture. Werner understood and showed him a nasty cut that had gotten infected. Miller whistled. That is bad, buddy. Come with me. Werner tried to explain he did not speak English. Miller just smiled and led him to the medical tent. Inside, American medics were already treating German wounded alongside American wounded. Werner could not believe it. The two sides that had been killing each other days ago were now sharing medicine and bandages that a German medic who spoke some English began helping the Americans. Together, they treated over 200 wounded soldiers that first day. The war had been about hate and killing. The surrender was about humanity and healing. WWII evening. A massive prisoner of war camp had been created in the fields. American trucks brought in food supplies. German prisoners received their first real meal in weeks. Men ate slowly, their stomachs unable to handle much after starving for so long. Mueller stood with Hayes and watched the camp organize itself. Your men have shown great kindness, Captain. This is not what we expected. Hayes looked at him. The Geneva Convention requires us to treat prisoners humanely. But more than that, the war is over for these men. They are somebody's sons, somebody's fathers. Same as my men. Mueller nodded. In the Soviet Union, we forgot this truth. We stopped seeing people as human. Now we run from our own crimes. The world will deal with those crimes, Hayes said. But right now, my job is to keep these people alive and get them processed properly. That night, Werner lay on the ground of the POW camp and looked at the stars. Around him, thousands of German soldiers slept peacefully for the first time in months. American guards walked the perimeter, but they were not cruel. They were just doing their job in the distance. Werner heard the rumble of Soviet artillery. The Red Army had reached the river they had crossed days before. But now there were American forces between them and the Soviets. The race was over. They had won their chance at survival by choosing the right direction to surrender. 3 days after the surrender, Private Hans Werner sat in the prisoner of war camp and wrote a letter. His hands shook as he held the pencil. He had not written to his mother in 6 months. He did not know if she was still alive. Hamburg had been bombed so many times that whole neighborhoods had disappeared. But he had to try. Dear Mother, he wrote in German. I am alive. I am a prisoner of the Americans, but I am safe. I have food and water. The guards treat us fairly. Please do not worry about me. I will come home when this is over. Your loving son, Hans. Around him, thousands of other German prisoners were doing the same thing. The Americans had provided paper and pencils. They had promised to deliver the letters through the Red Cross. It was a small kindness that meant everything to men who had been cut off from their families for so long. The prisoner of war camp had grown enormous. What started with Mueller's 8,000 soldiers had become over 30,000 in just 3 days. German units were surrendering to American forces all along the front. Every road leading west was packed with soldiers and civilians fleeing the Soviet advance. By May 7, 1945, the numbers had become staggering. Over 500,000 German soldiers had surrendered to American and British forces rather than face the Soviets. It was the largest mass surrender in military history. The American army had never planned for anything like this. Prison camps were overflowing. Supplies were running short. But the surrenders kept coming. Colonel Mueller stood near the camp fence and talked with Captain Hayes. The two men had developed a mutual respect over the past few days. They were both professional soldiers trying to manage an impossible situation. More prisoners arrived this morning, Hayes said. Another 10,000. We are running out of space. Mueller nodded. The word has spread through the German army. Every soldier knows that surrendering to the Americans means survival. Surrendering to the Soviets means death or a labor camp in Siberia. We are hearing reports from the Soviet zone, Hayes said quietly. It is not pretty. Mass arrests. Summary executions. Entire towns being cleared out. The Soviets are taking their revenge for what Germany did during the invasion. Mueller looked at the ground. We brought this upon ourselves. Operation Barbarossa was a crime. 3 million Soviet prisoners died in our camps. We destroyed their villages. We murdered their civilians. The Red Army has not forgotten this. But these soldiers here, Hayes gestured at the camp. Most of them are just kids who were drafted. They did not start this war. No, Mueller agreed. But they wore the uniform of the regime that did. Now they pay the price. Those who surrendered to us are the lucky ones. News reached the camp on May 8, 1945. Germany had officially surrendered. The war in Europe was over. When the announcement was made, the reaction in the prisoner camp was mixed. Some men cheered because the killing was finally done. Others wept because their country had been destroyed. Most just felt numb. Werner heard the news and felt nothing. No joy, no sadness, just emptiness. He was 19 years old, and his entire adolescence had been war. He did not remember what peace felt like. An American soldier approached him. It was Corporal Miller, the medic who had treated his infected arm. Miller held out a chocolate bar. "For you," Miller said in broken German. "War over. No more fight." Werner took the chocolate with shaking hands. He had not tasted chocolate in 3 years. He broke it in half and offered part back to Miller. The American medic smiled and accepted it. They sat together in silence, two young men who had been enemies and were now just human beings sharing candy. The stories that came out of the Soviet occupation zone were horrifying. German prisoners of war who surrendered to the Red Army were being sent to labor camps in Siberia and Kazakhstan. They would dig coal, cut timber, and work in factories until their bodies gave out. Of the 90,000 Germans captured at Stalingrad in 1943, only 5,000 survived to return home. The final survivors did not come back until 1956, over 10 years after the war ended. In contrast, German prisoners held by the Americans were being processed, fed, and would eventually be sent home. The difference was stark and clear. The choice to surrender west had saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Mueller received permission to speak to his men one final time before they were transferred to larger permanent camps. He stood on a wooden platform and looked at the faces watching him. Faces he had led through the final desperate days of the war. "Soldiers of the Wehrmacht," he began. "Our war is over. Our nation has been defeated. The regime we served has fallen. Many of you are angry. Many of you feel betrayed. Some of you believe we should have fought to the death." He paused and looked directly at Captain Kessler, who stood in the crowd with his arms crossed. "But I made a choice. I chose your lives over a lost cause. I chose your families over empty honor. I chose the possibility of rebuilding over the certainty of destruction. Some will call me a coward. Some will call me a traitor. I accept this." His voice grew stronger. "But look around you. You are alive. You will see your mothers and fathers again. You will hold your children again. You will help rebuild Germany from the ashes. This is not cowardice. This is survival. This is hope." The crowd was silent. Then one soldier began to clap. Then another. Within seconds, thousands of prisoners were applauding. Some were crying. Even Kessler's hard face had softened. Mueller stepped down from the platform and walked through the camp one last time. He had been a soldier for 25 years. He had served his country through 2 world wars. Now his service was over. History would judge him, but his conscience was clear. He had brought his men home. Werner finished his letter and gave it to an American guard to mail. He lay back on the ground and watched clouds drift across the sky. Somewhere in those clouds was the future. A future he had almost not lived to see. The choice of 500,000 German soldiers to surrender west had been driven by fear, yes, but also by the fundamental human desire to live. They had chosen hope over fanaticism. They had chosen tomorrow over yesterday. In doing so, they had shown that even in the darkest moments of history, the instinct for survival and humanity could overcome ideology and hate. The war was over. The rebuilding would begin. And these men who had chosen life would be part of building a better Germany that rejected the poison of the past. Mueller watched the sun set on the camp. Behind him lay the ruins of the Third Reich. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility. He had made his choice. He had saved his men. That was enough.